All right, folks, James Detroit here. We're going to do an interview today with the one, the only, the legendary, the world famous Bob, the Review Magazine Martin.
There's enough hyperbole going on. Come on.
Bob, welcome to the James Detroit. It's all about dialogue. We're seeking the truth. We're trying to connect dots. We're trying to talk and have, critical thinking conversations. And we got a chance to do some of that last Friday at the CWC meeting. I'm glad you were there.
Yep.
I hope I see you again, on a monthly basis at least.
Right.
And so, Bob, I want to ask you a series of questions that is very common with when I meet somebody for the first time. And because we didn't get a chance to the very first time I met you, and then last Friday, because it was more of a social setting and other people. So
right.
If I'm one-on-one with somebody, I typically kind of follow this format. So,
Sure.
Bob, where were you born?
I was born here in Saginaw, Michigan.
All right. And is your family originally from Saginaw?
Yes, they were. Yep. Actually, my grandfather came over here from Germany, and he made it through the Great Depression. And he had a pretty large family, and there were three brothers, actually four brothers. Three of them became attorneys, and my father was one of them, and they started the Martin & Martin law firm, which has been here in Saginaw for many years over on Court Street. Two of my cousins followed in the suit of their fathers, and they both became attorneys. I was going to become an attorney. I went to law school for 2.5 years, and I was going to go into environmental law, but I got very discouraged with a lot of things regarding standing issues and things. So I dropped out of law school, and I basically started the Review, because when I was in college, those were my two interests, was basically history, the law, and journalism and writing. So that's basically that.
Okay. Well, so you grew up in Saginaw. Where'd you go to high school? Where'd you graduate high school from?
Arthur Hill High School.
Oh, Arthur Hill. Okay. What year did you graduate?
I graduated in 1972.
Is that the great infamous George Eiler year of the undefeated, unscored upon?
That undefeated Saginaw Sports Hall of Fame team was the following year, 1973.
1973. Maybe the greatest ever high school football team. It's possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
All right. I played for Coach Eiler at Saginaw Valley, and I found him to be someone that you'd basically run through a wall for. Same with Plaz Presnell.
He's a total
very motivational guys.
Yep, for sure.
So you went to Saginaw Arthur Hill. I was going to ask you real quick, from Germany, do you know where? What?
Actually, they were Volga Germans, and that was like right on the line of the Volga River between Prussia and Germany. And
okay.
And so basically, they kind of escaped, basically what was going on there with the czars and everything.
Yeah.
And so they emigrated. Yeah.
So I asked because all parts of me are from Germany, and they happen to be from the same area in Germany, the Baden province, near Switzerland.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I find that somebody's family history is from Germany, I just ask, hey, where are you from?
Oh, that's cool. Yeah.
So Arthur Hill, and the college again that you went to?
I went to Albion College, and I studied basically, like I say, journalism and pre-law. My senior year, I went to the University of Sussex in England for a year. I won a scholarship, so I spent actually 18 months over there. And then I came back and I started Review Magazine when I was 24 years old in 1979. So I've been publishing it for 41 years now.
Wow. And obviously, coming from a pretty solid, sounds like a community entrenched family with the law business and everything. So, you probably had a nice opportunity there to be able to reach out, get some interviews maybe, or was that your focus, to do interviews, or to more community engagement, or what was the purpose of the Review Magazine start?
Right. Well, when I started it, it was for several reasons. Because at that time, I've always been interested in the arts, music, and politics as well, and community. And at the time, you had your daily publications, Bay City Times, you had the Saginaw News. And at that time, the region was becoming more and more connected. I mean, people find it hard to believe that back in 1972, when I graduated from high school, for example, Bay Road, there was just like one market out there and it was all farmland. And it was like a big deal when the mall was built because there was basically nothing out there. So that started developing, became more interconnected, as did Midland. So my idea was to try to do a publication that would kind of connect the Tri-City region, now known as the Great Lakes Bay area, together. So I did that at the time. I noticed, especially with investigative reporting, and there wasn't a lot of depth to anything. It was basically like small story news bites. So my idea was to, do investigative reporting, but also do interviews with local movers and shakers, important people in business, the arts, whatever. Kind of modeled after the old Playboy interviews, if you ever recall those. They would like get really famous people, like everyone from Malcolm X to Frank Sinatra, and they would interview. They would have these 20-page interviews with them on all types of topics. So I kind of used that as a template, and then the other thing I tried to do with it was just with the entertainment and arts organizations. There was all this stuff going around. There really wasn't a comprehensive calendar. People know what was happening. So we started this out and about section, which had all the events in the region. And that became really important. And then apart from that, we just tried to cover everything from sports to music to politics, kind of a broad-based, to develop kind of a broad-based readership.
Okay. The Great Lakes Bay Area,
Right.
The Tri-City area became the Great Lakes Bay Area.
Right.
Do you know kind of when that transition took place and when, or kind of who was responsible for that acronym?
Yeah, right. I mean, it was always called the Tri-Cities. Actually, it's been around now, I want to say, for probably pretty close to maybe, I'd say 7 to 10 years now. It kind of started through the chambers. They were trying to find a way to link and brand the region. So I know, like the Convention and Visitors Bureaus, they got some of those entities, and they just tried to figure out a way to develop this, all collectively market the region. And that's what they came up with, was the Great Lakes Bay region.
So I got to ask you, if you can narrow it down to one, who was the most famous interview that you've done?
Oh, wow. I can nail it down to more than one.
Well, famous, the most famous. How about give me three to five of the famous?
Several were very, very famous. But I would say right off the top of my head, probably the two most memorable, famous, actually three most memorable, famous interviews I did is I did an interview with Jane Goodall, who, as you may or may not know, was the woman that developed a language for speaking with apes. She did a lot of primal research, working with monkeys and stuff.
You talking Jane that went to Africa,
yes,
lived?
Yes.
Okay.
Worked with Coco and all that.
Yep, Dr. Jane. Yep, I remember her.
Yep. So I interviewed her. I interviewed Janet Jackson. That was pretty memorable.
Okay.
And let's see. And then I also, I've always been a big fan of Norman Mailer, who's a great writer. I think one of the best 20th century American writers. And I did a really long interview with him, as well as Joseph Heller. I interviewed as well when they spoke.
You said Norman Mailer and?
Joseph Heller, who wrote Catch-22.
Okay.
I interviewed him when he was out at, he was doing a writer's workshop at the Midland Center for the Arts. And I had an opportunity to interview him. Those are all real memorable.
Okay. If you could pick the most significant interview that you've done, like it was the most impactful, or I use the word significant because it seemed to do the most good or bring the most attention. It was the most significant interview. Could you narrow that down to? and
Boy,
maybe even discuss kind of what it was about.
honestly, I think one of the most insightful interviews I've done
Okay.
was with and it was relatively recent. It was about maybe a year or so ago, maybe less than a year ago. And I had an opportunity to interview Deepak Chopra, who was speaking at the temple, and I had a chance to do a pretty lengthy phone interview with him. I've got that interview that you can find in our archive on review-mag.com. But what was amazing about him is, he's a scientist, he's a doctor, he's a physicist, he's, into religion, into so many different areas of disciplined thought. And just the way he was able to address actually pretty basic things that we take for granted, such as the way we perceive things, what reality really is. How can we change realities or difficulties that we perceive ourselves going through? He had some really amazing insights there. For that reason, because of the possibilities that the way we view the world can impact not only the outcome of that world, but our own lives, I think that was an important interview. Now, I mean, I've done other interviews with people at different points in time that were important, in political realms and things like that. But overall, I think just because of the message that he was talking about, I thought it was a pretty significant interview.
Who, in your opinion, was your best interview? And I mean that because, this is technically my first interview, Bob. So I'm just doing what I do when I meet people one-on-one, and gonna see if it works or not. we'll figure that out later. But I think sometimes, from my perception would be from a journalist perspective, the best interview is the one that both you were, at your best game that day, and the person you're interviewing, and it was engaging, and it got to where you wanted it to get, or beyond what you thought it could be. That would be my interpretation of the best interview. So do you have an interview other than the one that you just mentioned that was, you considered the most significant? Do you have the best interview? Maybe it was the most fun, or it made the most, brought the most attention.
Well, there was a couple. I had a chance to interview the comedian Pat Paulson, who used to be on the Smothers Brothers, when he was running for president. And he was running for president as a quote.
Hold on, president of the United States.
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
The Smothers Brothers had their weekly show on
Yep.
CBS pulled it because it was too controversial. And
wait a minute. When censorship? When was that? What year was that?
Well, that was like in the Vietnam period. That was like in '68, I believe.
Oh yeah, no, I'm joking, because I know we've experienced censorship.
Right, I know.
Forever.
But anyway, it was kind of funny because there was this club in Saginaw called On Stage. It was down in Old Town Saginaw, and they would do a lot of bands and live entertainment. And for a while, they were bringing comedians in. And one year, this was like, in the early 80s, I think it was like when Reagan was running for president, they brought Pat Paulson in, and that year he ran every year for like 3 elections. He would, and he would have his banjo, and he was a funny guy, and he would just, it was a funny interview. And that was memorable. Another one, let's see, as far as that I felt really good about, and that I felt I had a good rapport with the person, and that brought out a lot of information that I didn't know, was actually an entertainment interview. And it got a lot of response too. But I had the chance to interview Peter Tork from the Monkees.
Oh.
And he was a really good interview. I learned a lot from him.
On that note, I want to make sure I get this right. It's the reviewmag.com.
It's our website, our online edition is it's review-mag.com.
So hyphen then. It would be the hyphen. Okay. So review-mag.com.
Yeah.
And that brings me to my question, because you've been in this game for, originally it was a paper, correct? That you were.
It still is. We still do publish the print edition, but we've had to suspend it for um, the last 3 issues because of the lockdown, pretty much.
Yeah,
Only about 80% of our places that we usually deliver at are closed now. So
sure. And you probably have a larger audience now through the online.
it's amazing how our stats have blown up since we've just been going online.
Yeah,
We missed the print edition because we published 20,000 copies, and we only have about a 1% return rate. So people pick them up, and people have this perception that print is kind of dead or dying, but that has not been the case for me. I mean, it's interesting because I find a lot of older demographics, especially, they like a physical object that they can hold, read, touch, that's tangible, they can save it. Unlike, the ephemeral stuff that goes online, it's there, gone. You can hopefully dig it up if it's not pulled or banned or whatever.
yeah, that's crazy. So that's what I had written down here was the passing of print. And I can remember going down to the city of Flint, going into the Flint Journal building, and going up to, put in and pay my money for the garage sale advertisement that was going to have to go in, or I wanted to list something for sale, or I wanted to put on a ball tournament, and so I needed to get the advertisement in the sports section. And I didn't go down there a lot, but it was, number one, I'm a kid from the country. And so getting to this downtown Flint, going into a larger building, trying to find the place to go, the person to see, fill it out, pay the money. And it was an experience as a younger man.
Sure.
And I think the old Saginaw News building is where CMURC is now.
Yes.
And I can picture something similar to that happening to a kid that's showing up to do the same thing in Saginaw. And my grandfather, my dad's dad, my grant, he read the paper every day, and he did the crossword puzzle in the Detroit Free Press. That's what he did. And I enjoyed the comics. I enjoyed the sports section, checking on the stats, the standings. But I can remember getting on your fingers, and I can remember, it was the print aspect of getting the news.
Right.
And I can also, there is a difference between reading something and having my ability to ingest what I've just read.
Right.
Because text, and we find that today, when people text us,
right.
It's so dependent. Those words are so dependent upon my mood when I read them,
right.
How I interpret what was written. And
right.
So we've had such a tremendous transition in our culture in the United States of America in how news is delivered to us.
Right.
And it's so much through mainstream media, and really 6 corporations are running so much of this narrative. And so the passing of print, because I do have a couple of papers here that I do read, and then I like to print things out when I find an article that I think is very important, and then I print it out, and okay, am I burning up trees? I am, but I want that article for later. I want to be able to find it. And
right.
At the CWC meetings, we print things out, and I typically leave them out on the table so people can find them. These are articles that I have found interesting, and I encourage people to read them, pick them up and read them.
Right.
So the passing of print, from your perspective, and I'm glad to hear that you still are printing a
right.
paper, but all of this that I've just said, can you comment on how you agree, disagree, or want to expand upon how important or how significant and how little it's talked about the passing of print has now become in the delivering of the messages that we're receiving?
Right. Well, I mean, I think it's interesting that, you still have a lot of publications that are in print. Granted, dwindling, but in terms of news publications, you still have, your Time magazine, you still have Rolling Stone, is still in print. They do both a magazine and online. I think that in your comments about, the importance of something tangible that you're holding, that works on a couple different levels too. And I think it's important to note the same thing is true with books. I mean, it's not just periodicals. I mean, myself, I like to have a physical copy of a book. If I'm on a beach, I don't want to have like my laptop get saved, whatever. I want something that I can look at, reference, go back to. And especially in terms of articles, in terms of as we've transitioned to this brave new digital world, and just the way that information can be varied or pulled, I think it's very important to have tangible copies of things that are referenced, that you can hold on to, that save for a fire or a natural disaster, they're suddenly not going to disappear overnight. And, to me, that's a disturbing trend, especially in the last couple weeks. In the instance with important data that has come out, medical data regarding COVID, and the way YouTube and Google have basically just pulled that information. All of a sudden, rather than being a resource for information so that people can make their own decision based upon what frontline doctors are doing, it's like and to me, the role of the media has always been an important role of the media, has always been as a watchdog. So the fact now that you have these these entities pretty much leading and shaping what should be a medical and a scientific narrative rather than a partisan one, that's disturbing to me.
Well, you remind me of, I relate so many things to movies.
Mm-hmm.
And The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, if you remember that movie with
Right.
John Wayne and Jimmy Stewart, and Rance Stoddard. And I remember the idea that they were going to go to the statehood convention, if you remember, and they were taking a vote, and they wanted the guy who wrote the local paper, they wanted him to go represent, and he gets up and he gives that big soliloquy about, I'm the press. I can't be a politician. I'm the press. I hold you accountable, right? He's storming around, no. And then he takes it anyway and he goes because he can best represent, the voice of the people, because that's what he was trying to do as the paper was being the voice of the people. Well, the things that I started seeing that seem to be wrong in our political landscape that caused me to vote for H. Ross Perot in 1992,
right,
have only become even more exacerbated, or they've exponentially greater, because I feel like when all of the people, if I turn on that television, all of the people are telling me the same thing, and I find it interesting and disturbing at the same time, in that if you just do a quick flip through of all the channels, it's like they're getting talking points, like the things you have to say on the next broadcast. And obviously people add a word or two here or there, and they have different accents and they have different speech patterns, but it's the exact same underlying message.
Honestly, James, I can tell you, I'll give you a little insight about that. I started noticing this probably around the year 2000, not just in terms of major national news, but in terms of state and regional news. Now, it used to be that whether you were dealing with broadcast or print media, you had a newsroom, and you had reporters that would dig this stuff up, information, do stories. But as the costs have gone up, one of the things over the last 10, probably longer actually, probably over the last 20 years that has happened is a lot of news organizations have cut their journalism budgets in terms of their reporters. They don't have the staff that they used to. And they're all ad driven now, a lot of them, so they have good sales teams. But in terms of the actual news content, they don't have the number of reporters that they used to have. Right around the same time, especially 10 years ago, I started noticing that I'd be getting a lot more quote unquote news stories from different government agencies and sources. They would basically have the story written and just different talking points. And I think that's kind of self-explanatory. I think that's what's happened. And I think as that whole situation has unfortunately exacerbated, especially in terms of, really having good frontline reporters around that can develop their own stories, more and more news organizations are relying upon the government to provide the data and the information for them. And I don't know, I kind of see that. And I think that's something that's another topic, probably longer than we'll ever have time for here. But I mean, what I've noticed out of this whole COVID crisis is it's kind of like the rise of technocracy. We think we live in a democracy where we have these representative institutions, but now we're finding that these representative institutions aren't even meeting. I mean, look at when we passed the PPP and the CARES Act, half the Senate wasn't even there. I mean,
Right.
And that's happening on a lot of different.
Half of the House of Representatives. It was just over half.
Right.
In order to constitutionally actually have a quorum, which would mean more than 50% in presence, and then they just took a voice vote anyway. Nobody was actually tied to it. I think it was by design. I continually give shouts out to Representative Massey from Kentucky, who called his coworkers out and said, the Constitution requires that at least half of us are here. And there's so many things that have gone wrong, and you're right. We're going to have to do more interviews in order to get deeper into it. But you're talking about investigative journalism.
Yeah, well, what my point is too with this technology is all of a sudden we have these experts that government officials are relying upon, and they're not elected representatives. They're people from the health department, they're people from intelligence community, they're basically bureaucrats, but they're dealing with data and they're dealing with science, and they're taking the heat off of our elected representatives because they don't really need to be accountable to their constituents if they're relying on the testimony and evidence from the experts. That's a whole different animal than I think something, it kind of makes our democratic institutions almost irrelevant right now because everything's being based on what so-called experts that are unelected people are saying.
Well, that lack of real investigative journalism, and I know that there's a few people out there that are still doing it. Thank goodness. Whenever somebody in mainstream media says that's been debunked already, that's already been debunked. I mean, we don't even need to discuss it anymore. Move on. And I think, why are all of them saying it? And I mean all of them being, if you go to ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, MSNBC, they're all saying it. All the different talking heads are saying it. And I just think, well, if they're all saying it, we probably should be looking into it. You mentioned a great interview just because of the way talking about life and that perspective on how to look at things. And the first thought that came to my mind is Jordan Peterson. Are you familiar with Jordan Peterson from Canada?
Not really, no.
Okay, so I've been introduced to a few of the things and his perspective on things. I'm going to suggest that to you. I don't know that I have the capabilities of being able to get that interview, but I'm going to ask that, make a suggestion. Hey, Bob, have you gotten a hold of Jordan Peterson? Can you get the interview yet? I want you to get that interview, Jordan Peterson. I think that would be a fantastic and enlightening interview.
Okay.
I also have down here, just because you're a person from Saginaw,
yeah,
I don't know as much about Saginaw as maybe I do other places specifically, but I have had the opportunity to enjoy lunch, and I believe it's the Saginaw House.
Saginaw Club.
Okay, so the Saginaw Club.
Yeah.
And it's sort of different. I mean, the building, and so what can you tell me about the Saginaw Club?
Well, the Saginaw Club it's been around for a long time now.
I want to say like 1922 or something. I mean, it's like 100 years old.
Yeah, it predates that even. It was started by a lot of the city forefathers, a lot of the main merchants and a lot of the bankers and a lot of the city fathers that kind of established a lot of the city and their institutions. And they developed this private club. And over the years, they've had members, they've had their controversies because it was a private club for a long time. They wouldn't let women join, and there was a few lawsuits filed on that end. Now they have opened it up to that. But yeah, it's just, it's like, I don't know. They have similar things in different parts of the country. Like, in St. Louis, I know they have the Washington Society. They have different similar types of private clubs, but yeah, it's a beautiful building. And actually, there was a book that just came out about its history that you can get. I've got some info on that. I can email it to you.
Well, when I was in there, I noticed that there was a picture of a woman. Do you know anything about the picture, the portrait? It's not just a picture. This is an elaborate portrait of a woman. Do you know anything about her?
Right. I believe the picture you're talking about is a portrait that was done of a woman named Rosie. I can't remember her last name. It's escaping me right now. But the deal there is, the story behind her is that back in the time of the Great Depression, and actually predating that, Water Street along Saginaw, which is where Old Town is now, was full of bars and saloons. And it also had whorehouses. And go back to the lumbering era. And Rosie owned a brothel, and it was a bar. And she made a lot of money. And she never put her money in a bank, which is interesting. She just kept it wherever, in her safe, under her bed, who knows. But apparently, when the Depression hit, a lot of the key businessmen in the area, like, we're talking like, the Morleys, Wickses, a lot of McDonald's, a lot of these, huge entities, they were losing it. And Rosie lent them money so that their businesses would not go bust. And that painting, to my understanding, was made by the members of the Saginaw Club just to honor her for what she did to save them during the time of the Great Depression. That's my understanding of it.
I like that. I like that.
Yeah, I can't remember her last name right now. I should, but I'm just can't remember. But that's her. I know her first name was Rosie Morton. That was her name. Rosie Morton.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Well, here's to Rosie. We like great American stories like that. I do. I appreciate it. I appreciate that it is not about the government, and it's not about a regulated banking system that obviously couldn't get it done at that time.
Right.
And it's I think it's so important, an aspect of real legitimate win-win deals being done between Bob and James,
right,
who we say, you know what, I got this thing going on, I want to, like for you, if you wanted to expand the paper and for whatever reason the bank didn't want to give you any money because somebody's suing the Review magazine because they said you were okay and they don't want to give you any money being tied to it, but you know what, Jim, for $10,000 I can expand my business. I don't have it, I'll pay you back. We have a handshake, we have an agreement, and I help my buddy out who then pays me back, and next thing you know, you're doing well and I need a hand. And that's what is so easy for so many of us to do, because we're human beings and we so easily engage in those relationships. We don't have to have the government tell us how to do these things, but that's an example on a much larger scale at a yesteryear, but it still speaks to me today.
Right.
Can you tell me, because I've heard rumblings, there's in our nation's history, you've got the mafia of New York City and the East Coast, and the Irish mafia and movements in Boston area. You've got the Italian mafia and the New York and tri-state area there. You've got the Capone mafia in the Chicago area, and then of course you had the Purple Gang that is I think more aligned with the Jewish mafia in the Detroit area. But supposedly, over the years, Saginaw had its connections to the mafioso. And are you able to shed any light on some of that?
Yeah, actually, there's a great book called With Purpose and Honor, and it was written by this guy named Phil Kirby, who was an FBI agent based out of Detroit, and he basically thinks in this area of all the mafia stuff that was going on. And basically what that was basically linked to was all the stuff that went on with Jimmy Hoffa. And at the time, he was basically investigating Sam Giancana and Tony Provenzano, and I believe it was one of the Liakonovs. And they were all in Saginaw. They were supposedly all tied to, the Detroit Mafia. And he wrote his own story, his own account about it, detailed accounts about what he found. And it's a pretty fascinating read, actually. Several of the people were arrested and went to jail. They did their time. But yeah, there's some pretty crazy stuff in that book. It's worth checking out.
Okay. All right. Well, you mentioned being able to have books before they get rid of them. And I mentioned this at the CWC meeting on Friday, and it's The 100-Year Lie. And I've encouraged people to read that book. Mm-hmm. And I went ahead and we bought, they're on their way, they're getting shipped, but we decided to buy 5 copies of that just so that I could kind of have them in our group.
Right, I've done that.
And we can share them, read them. I'm a very slow reader, and I couldn't put that book down in a weekend. And so I know that most anybody will be able to read it over a weekend. And I read that book. I'm trying to think exactly when I read it. It was like 2008 or 2009. Uh-huh. I know I was already living in the house I'm in now, and we've been here 14 years. So it was right in that 2008 range, 2009. And it is one of the most significant aspects of me re-engaging my critical thinking cap. And I used to be, I used to hunt a lot, and I found myself having deep thoughts sitting in a tree in the woods, right? Just watching nature. And I often said, man, I wish I had something that I could just get all my thoughts down, because I'm solving, every time I go hunting, I'm solving all the world's problems right here. I've got it. Things like, I remember writing this down in some of my journals. Is it possible for me to have an original thought? This is the kind of things that I get deep into, and just some of the writings of St. Augustine that have enlightened me or motivated me to think a little bit deeper. And I wonder if we do enough of that today, and that's really been the purpose for you and I to do this interview. Right. So much of the James Detroit podcasts have become just trying to have more dialogue. Right. Is there a thought that we could ever have? Can we have an original thought, or is it always going to be something that's already been out there that needs to be revisited even? And I think it's so important when we're talking about that mainstream media and the press continually pounding us with the same storyline, the same narrative, the same. I look at it like this. Academia, I think, has veered severely on the wrong path when they tell us what to think instead of how to think.
Right. I mean, I think one of the biggest dangers with our educational system right now is it relies way too much on like multiple choice tests, rather than when I was in college, you had essay tests where you would actually have to write and show what you learn, show a process of reasoning. It's very rare to find that nowadays, in college testing, which amazes me, because, multiple choice tests can be so subjective in the terms of, a lot of times there can be more than one correct answer, right?
I agree with that. And in a small classroom setting,
Yeah.
I was the kid, and this is going back to, I remember Mrs. Fader in the third grade, or in the fourth grade, I'm sure she wanted to pull her hair out because I'm challenging, well, no, C can also be an answer. It's not just B. And here's the reasons why. And I can remember the cafeteria ladies, because my mom worked in the kitchen at the time at the elementary school. And I can remember being in there before school one day and sharing my story. And the cafeteria lady said, "You're going to be a lawyer someday."
Right. But getting back to it, there was, a really, really good book that was written about the educational system that I read back when I was in high school. And the point of the author in that book was basically that the educational system has gotten to a point where it's structured not to teach you how to learn so much as to know the right answer. Which, there's a big difference. And I think getting back to what your question was asking, in terms of critical thinking, I don't know if people now, whether it's the fact that they're impatient, whether it's the fact that they want answers now, that the society, so much of it has become instant and instant gratification and whatever, but it's like they want to know the answer. They don't want to think about what the implications of that answer are, the process that went to develop that answer. They just want to know the answer. And they want someone to tell them what the answer is. And that's kind of scary. Anyway, that's my thought about it.
Well, you mentioned the experts, or, they want the answer. The experts are telling them this is what the answer is.
Right.
And I think this whole climate change, which in the 70s, we were being told headed for the next ice age. In the 90s and early 2000s, we were told it's global warming. Then it's become, well, it's actually just climate change. It's more general than that even, and we have to do it. And I go back to the things that we have been told by the experts that continuously have not happened. Now, I have an earth science minor, and I recognize that human beings need to be conscious of what we do to the environment. We cannot be reckless. We have to be responsible. And I'm not to say that I'm an anti-environmentalist. I want it to be proven with science. I want it to be for the right reasons. And the idea that, if we don't stop this right now, and this is in the late 90s, New York City is going to be underwater. It's going to look like Venice in the next 20 to 25 years.
Kind of happening now, though.
That's my point. That's my point, is that when I'm asked, why don't you believe it? The ice caps are melting. Why don't you believe it? Okay, well, and I do something as simple as, and it's not, obviously this isn't exact, but I do something as simple as, fill up the glass of ice and go ahead and put water in it up to the top, and then wait for the ice to melt. Is it overflowed onto your, it's taken up similar space. The argument against that would be, well, the glaciers and the ice and snow caps that are over top of land masses are then going to go into the ocean surfaces, and you don't necessarily have that elsewhere. But the point is that the scientific method of creating a hypothesis, going through the whole process of finding out based on real peer reviews, other people that do not have an agenda, objectively looking at something, and then revisiting that same hypothesis, and then maybe creating a slightly different hypothesis, and continuously learning. We've thrown that away with science says, therefore you listen, you obey, being the masses. And I think it's I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting from the environmental standpoint when we're told these things that never come to pass. And I realize that human beings do have an impact. Not, I don't believe it has.
As far as all that, I mean, the fact is, the Earth has been getting warmer. Now, the reason why, ice caps, that's definitely a concern. Will Florida be left? What's going to happen? Yeah, I mean, what I find interesting, though, too, is that right now, especially since we have had all these lockdowns, I mean, have you seen some of the photos from space? It's like all of a sudden,
Oh, yeah.
Yep. It's like a great opportunity for the planet to kind of heal for,
So on that note, so we have an impact on the environment.
Absolutely. Now,
But
stuff. The question is, there's a lot of actions that could have been taken. The question is, are they being taken too late? Is it too late? I mean, you've got Australia. There's parts of it that are just frying up. What can you do at this point? That's the question. What can be done? I don't know. I mean, I don't know.
So my question is, and I think we've had another major earthquake somewhere.
Right.
And the vast majority of carbon emissions is from the erosion of limestone. Both our mountain ranges, plus if a volcano erupts, the earth opens up through an earthquake. These things are happening. We can't control them. The people that want to control us, suggesting that we can control these natural occurrences, are saying it's because of the human abuse of the earth that we have more earthquakes, we have more volcanic eruptions. Again, not saying that this is our hypothesis and we're going to try to scientifically evaluate that. They're saying, I'm an expert, you need to listen to me, and we need to eliminate cows, or we need to eliminate air travel, or we need to eliminate. That's the position that I find myself, I want to fight, I want to defend. You can't make me do something because you think something is going to happen. That's, from an environmental standpoint, I become very defensive when we and I'm a person that cares. I'm a person that cares about the environment. I'm not just believing that we should just randomly dump hazardous waste out into the environment.
I mean, one of the reasons I got into the law was because I wanted to go into environmental law. And one thing I learned is that, it's like anything. Certain things you've got to have regulations for. I mean, we know certain things. Like, we know it's not a good idea to throw toxic waste into fresh water. I mean,
certainly.
That stuff you want to have stiff penalties on. You want everybody to adhere to it. The same is true when you've got like chemicals from chemical plants. They're leaching into, like, say, agricultural soil, coming from a farm family, where you've got, chemicals from whatever. They could be, whatever, leaching out from a vat that was supposed to hold them, and all of a sudden they spoil the land and you contaminate the land. You got to have rules that people adhere to protect the environment. Now, whether they adhere to it or not, what the penalties are, that's another question, Actually, it's kind of interesting, and this is not really that far off point, but there was a really good book I read from this Harvard economist who was also an environmentalist called Managing the Environment. And his whole argument was that, and it always amazed me to this day that a lot of that stuff he was advocating was never really adopted by policymakers. But his whole point was that, okay, for years we've had this gold standard. Well, what can you really do with gold? Nothing. You can't eat it. You can't. It's there. It's a mineral. It's a system of value that societies have agreed upon. And his whole argument was that what we need to do is take the most important resources that we have on the planet, namely our air, our water, our soil, and basically create a standard where that was the gold standard of value, so that anything that is done should, and values within the society should be predicated upon what value you assign to that. And if you do that, then all of a sudden those costs are internalized rather than externalized. The whole value system and the whole economy will be based on valuing those resources rather than deprecating them. And it's kind of an abstract argument, but he had really good detailed implementation points on it. But I mean, I think it's something worth considering. You know, I mean, it's like, how do we establish value in society? I mean, that's really what the question comes down to. What is valuable?
Well, I'm not emphatically disagreeing with that, but the very first thing that comes to my mind when you tell me that is a good citizenship scorecard and evaluation system that could be implemented by our government based on whether or not we empty out our cigarette butts at the gas station or at a stop sign, right? I mean, we don't see it as often. Now, you are a smoker. I grew up in a family of smokers, and that was something that you did. When you got to a stoplight and you had to wait, you'd empty your cigarettes out, right? That's something people did.
There's always delinquents.
But the idea that we can have going back to the Saginaw Club and honoring Rosemary, was that what her name? Rosie Morton.
They called her Rosie. Yeah.
Yep, Rosie. So that we could have some deals outside of the bureaucracy of an existing banking system, right, and still get a community, serve the community, and it's for the best interest of the community, win-win deals. And I think, okay, I'd like to think, because from a farming community, you said you were from, and I grew up a little bit in the farms, not big farms, but smaller. And we would think that it's okay if Monsanto gives us the fertilizer or tells us we can do this with the seeds that's been chemically doctored, but we're going to be upset with the guy who didn't realize that the underground storage tank that was supposed to be holding the fuel, to help promote industrialization, leached out into and caused a problem. So we're going to fine him to where he could never operate again.
Horizon, that was probably one of the most worst things down in the Keys there.
Say that again?
Well, I said, just look at Deepwater Horizon, the oil spill, the Gulf oil spill that happened that just decimated all the bay down in Florida there, a few years ago.
So I have mentioned that many times, Bob. I'm glad you brought that up. I didn't think about talking about it, but I've used that example in correlating, looking at the government's delay or the government's procedure leading up to COVID-19, our current pandemic. And I can remember when that British Petroleum leak occurred, and it was not until later, but I can remember, and in my time frame, I could be off this a little bit, but it seems like the leak occurred in late March. In April, President Obama was asked about it. He said, I am aware of it in a press conference. I am aware of it, and I'm told everything's just fine. It's not a big deal. Basically, what British Petroleum ended up saying later, and people that did some investigative reporting on this, and not enough was done. To your point from Friday's meeting, there's not enough investigative reporting on these types of things. But what does really seem to shed light on this is British Petroleum could have fixed that the day the leak occurred. They knew it, they could fix it. But the protocols, the bureaucracy requires for them to call the EPA, tell them we're going down to fix this. They were told, stand down, don't do it, don't touch it. This went on for a significant period of time, somewhere 10, 12, 14 weeks, until the leak becomes so big. Now the president's in front of national media saying this gives us a reason why we can't have offshore drilling.
Yeah,
And I would like to see more legitimate investigative research into those things. People would say, why? It's 15 years ago. It was 10 years ago. We don't need to look at that anymore. I think we do. I think it's an underlying issue.
Actually, the interesting thing, because I did investigate that quite a bit when it was all happening, and actually what happened there was a case where, which unfortunately is also a problem with centralized government, is the fact that they didn't have enough inspectors to check out those wells. The EPA had been gutted to the point where they were, they had maybe one inspector for every 20 wells they were supposed to be investigating. And therefore, they couldn't get to them soon enough to actually diagnose if there was a problem with those wells or not. Like with the event with Deepwater Horizon, that well, the inspector went there, 2 weeks late because the appointments got delayed, did kind of a periphery, not a real thorough inspection. And then when the thing bust, it became almost impossible to contain it. Again, so I guess it comes down to the point of, there's certain things to my mind that are so important, you don't want to cheap out on inspecting them and keeping them up to code. And that's kind of like a breakdown, I think, in terms of what happens to the point where, and I mean, you can look at this a lot of different levels too. I mean, just in terms of national security, how many people do we actually need to keep certain things secure in this country? I mean, to me, there's a lot of things that can be learned out of COVID. One is like, especially in the case with, medicines and testing equipment and things like that, I think all that stuff, should be like manufactured here in the United States.
I agree.
A lot of our drugs should be. And I really think, all the money that the freaking Pentagon has, that should be part of our national defense budget. I mean, we should basically have a stockpile of test vaccines, whatever stuff is there, and that should be counted as part of our national security. I mean, look at what not having it has kind of done right now to the situation. So, I mean, there's a role for government and there isn't, and I really think that, in this instance, it's like you mentioned also, what we were talking about earlier, like with Rosie Parks and things like that, it's like a lot of times, and that's why the beauty of our constitutional system, I think, in reserving certain powers to the states and keeping certain powers to the federal government is so wise. Because, I mean, in this instance right here, Rosie at that time of the Depression, she knew these guys, she left them, she bailed them out. When the first lockdown hit in March, I knew I was going to have 80% of my revenue streams cut down because of the lockdown. And the first thing I did was I started a GoFundMe campaign for the review. And I said, look, I've been doing this 40 years. It's been a free publication. You can enjoy what we've done, please contribute. And I was amazed because within a week I had $1,200 in donations. I had some guy just mail me $300 out of the blue saying this is for the Fourth Estate. And stuff like that is really humbling. I mean, it is. It's not only gratifying, but to me, it's humbling. And to me, that shows that's immediate aid. That wasn't waiting 6 weeks to get PPP. That wasn't waiting 8 weeks. It was immediate relief. Same way Rosie provided, And I think there's something to be said and learned from that,
I think there's more of a value when it's coming from the community in which we live.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
You mentioned the centralized government. I agree with you that I think this COVID-19 pandemic has really displayed especially from our healthcare standpoint.
Right.
When we look at how this pandemic has destroyed single-payer healthcare, centralized healthcare for all systems in Canada and in UK and in France and Spain and Italy, I think we should be talking more about how we absolutely will demand that there's going to be a private sector healthcare provided, that we get a chance to decide. And even more importantly, with the whole HCQ, hydroxychloroquine controversy that's been there, can't use it unless there's double-blind, peer-reviewed placebo studies and all these things for an off-label use, but you're going to use remdesivir, and now there seems to be a connection with Fauci, the Chinese Communist Party, and the patents with Gilead and remdesivir. So I feel like there's this overwhelming, if we just left our healthcare system to a more centralized governance, like single payer, like healthcare for all, we would lose one of our most basic fundamental rights, and that is for you to decide if you want to have a cigarette, for me to decide what I want to put in my body based on talking to my doctor, what you want to decide whether or not you get a vaccine or not. And it would become more mass and mandatory medical procedures based on what the government's telling the doctor to tell us, as opposed to me having a conversation with the doctor. And I just feel like this has become very, very center. This is very focused. We need to take advantage of this time to fight this, not let them take advantage of the crisis.
Right. I mean, there's different things going on there. I mean, as far as single payer, I do see value in it, in the sense that you look at societies where it does work. One that comes to mind right now, and I mean, it's amazing, and we should talk about it a little bit too, is Sweden, because of the fact that, as we all know, they have a socialized healthcare system, but they also have one of the finest systems in the world. It's people pay so much money, their citizens do, for their healthcare. And what I find really interesting, the WHO actually applauded Sweden recently. At first, they were very critical of them because, interestingly, Sweden, their constitution, they could not force lockdowns on their people, force quarantine. And consequently, they were one of the only countries in Europe where social distancing was all voluntary. And people had to maintain their 6 feet, wash their hands, avoid, but it was all voluntary. And initially, they had really high stats, probably some of the worst in Europe, because it wasn't a mandatory lockdown, it was a voluntary social distancing. But then you look at now what's coming out is, unlike a lot of countries in Europe, they've pretty much tested all of their rest of their citizenry, because they have this really good healthcare system, and they were able to actually test all these people. And now they're finding that 80% of the people they're testing that were infected have actually developed antibodies or are recovering. And in that sense, it's kind of telling and encouraging in a way, because I do think that that we're going to find antibodies, because the resilience,
Well, and I'll say a couple of things about that.
And then there's one other thing I wanted to mention too, is with the HCL and all that. What I do find disturbing about that too, in the sense is, I just read a thing the other day, about how in 2005, Fauci, with his Institute of National Health, published a study about how that stuff was really effective in dealing with SARS-CoV patients, and actually recommending it, And then you see stuff out of, what was it? I just read two. Oh yeah, it was, I can't remember the French equivalent of Fauci. I think his name is Guido Ariel or whatever, but he's like the equivalent of that in France.
Okay.
100% of the people he's administered to have recovered, and that it also is a preventative, So
well, I took
interesting that all that happens, and then what happens is all of it, then Cuomo, he kind of says, no, in March, we're not going to use this. A few days later, Michigan followed suit. Fauci's starting to equivocate on it. No, it hasn't been proven yet. Back in 2005, he was all behind it. So, yeah, there's a lot of questions to my mind.
There is a lot of questions. And so a couple of things. Number one, the gentleman I'm thinking of that you might be referring to is Dr. Didier Raoult.
Right.
And so he is actually with Harvard, or not Harvard, Stanford Medical. He is considered to be the world's, not the United States, he's considered to be the world's leading epidemiologist. And I think I see, so his French study now has over 1,061 COVID-19 patients, good clinical outcome and virological cure in 973 patients, or 91.7%. Poor outcome for 46 patients, that's 4.3%. 8 deaths, and those deaths range from 74 to 85 years of age, with, as the full study details, those were more severe cases with more underlying comorbidities and only a handful of very small side effects. And I'm going to point to another pic that I took because I keep forgetting this gentleman's name. And Dr. Osley, let me see if I can get this. Dr. Raman, it's Oskoui, Oskui. He has been regularly stating, he's a very well-renowned cardiologist. He's been regularly stating, for anybody that'll listen to him, and not very many people, almost none of the mainstream media puts him on, that from a cardiologist standpoint, the potential heart risks that the rest of the mainstream media is suggesting with hydroxychloroquine is so minimal, it's not even worth discussing. As a matter of fact, he states, this is not going to be done with somebody in ICU or under the hospital care without being monitored. We're not going to, the side effects are so minimal and the upside is so beneficial. Why are we not doing this? And I had to give you one more thing about Sweden, but if you want to make a comment, go ahead and I'll come back to Sweden.
I just want to say about that too, what I find interesting is that, when Fauci was kind of turning sour about chloroquine and HCl, he cited this Veterans Hospital study, but I mean, in that study, it was interesting because all the patients were given it when they were on their deathbed. It was like,
yes,
great. And in order for it to be effective, it has to be done early. And why you would bring that one study up out of all these other ones,
exactly,
it just makes me question some things. And the only thing, honestly, the only reason I can think about it is because it's such a cheap remedy, and maybe big pharma can't make enough money out of it, so they don't want to. I don't know.
Again, the patent, I'm not certain on this, but my understanding is once the patent expires, and then you can make a generic drug, you don't make as much money, more people benefit from it.
Right.
And there's so many issues that we could get into just talking about big pharma. Let's make that our next talk. But about Sweden, I think that they have tested maybe 20% or 25% of their population, which gives you, we don't have to test everybody in America. That's one of the things that is so disappointingly wrong about mainstream media telling you have to have mandatory, everybody get tested before we can go back to normal. We don't have to do that. We know from the law of large numbers, after taking random samples, we get the idea of how many people are infected. But so they've tested somewhere a very high percentage of their population. But remember Sweden. Sweden is the size of California, and it has the same amount of people in New York City, basically. There's 10 to 11 million people in the entire country of Sweden. It's the same size as California, which has over 40 million people. It's the 6th largest economy in the world is California in and of itself. Right. And so I'm not discrediting the benefits that Sweden has had from a centralized single-payer healthcare, but I'm saying it's so difficult to really, from a logistic standpoint and understanding. And the last thing on that is, I agree with what Sweden has done, keeping their schools open, keeping their businesses open, asking people to be responsible so that our human immune system gets a chance to actually defeat this virus and have a better chance at defeating the mutation of the virus, which also leads to, there's not this draconian influence of needing to wear a mask in public, or you're not, if you don't follow the rules. I just think we can look at some of the things that Sweden's done because of the fact China has this virus breakout. The countries before it gets here at a significant level, the countries that did the same thing that China did in locking people in, shutting people down, had more deaths. And where we did it the most, which was in New York City, we had the most deaths.
Right.
Why were we so quick to judge Sweden and say they're nuts? And the WHO was very critical of them. And then, just like it's not going to be a problem here, the flu is going to kill more people than this virus, to, 5 million people are going to die, we got to do something right now, to don't wear a mask, it's not going to help you, to, yes, if you're going to go out, you need to wear a mask now. Everything seems to be bizarro world. And I use a comic illustration with Superman. If you remember the episode where he fights Bizarro Superman, which is Superman, but it's everything opposite. He's bad. And I just think everything they've told us is actually the opposite of what we should have been doing.
Everything they told you is wrong. Well, I don't know. What I find interesting is the fact that, like Dr. Erickson, one of the things that he was talking about was, and he said it's kind of like epidemiology 101. It kind of reflects what's going on in Sweden. Is that, by forcing lockdown, you're actually prolonging the crisis, because it extends the period and also diminishes the ability of people that are locked down to develop immunities to it. And that's really not being talked about that much either, in the mainstream media. But that these other countries that were able to do this more of a horizontal as opposed to a vertical approach, or vertical as opposed to a horizontal approach, are kind of showing. And then the other thing, I got to get running here kind of soon, but one thing I wanted to mention, I did look up today, and I thought this was interesting, the latest terms of active cases that are going on with COVID in the world. It's at 2,214,175.
Confirmed, right? Confirmed.
Right. And out of those, there's like 48,073 in critical condition. So actually 98% of the cases are in mild recovering conditions, and it's looking like only 2% of them are, in real severe, close to fatal conditions. And
of the 2%, what we're finding is the significant, like the average death rate is 78.5. Some people are saying it's between 80 and 82.
Right.
It's how much you have these underlying conditions, these comorbidities. Right. And I'm not a doctor. You're not a doctor, but we can read. Right. We can infer so many things from this. And I keep getting back to that whole, we got to flatten the curve. We can't have our health system overrun. Never once saying, but in doing so, we'll be widening and prolonging these effects to where they'll be even longer and more devastating to more people. And on top of that, poverty kills.
Oh, yeah.
Poverty kills more. And then when you have the UN, which I don't really believe a lot the UN says, but they make a pretty good point that they're starting to suspect that this economic shutdown globally is going to result in between 125 and 250 million deaths. This is, we've made a mistake. And Bob Martin, Bob, James, Ray, all of us, we're all responsible. Ben, we're all responsible, because a lack of action is almost as condemning as doing something, even if it was the wrong thing.
Right.
But we have to put an effort forth to do a better job regaining our constitutional republic. You know these things I talk about, Bob. I get to now I get on my soapbox. Now I get a little bit riled up here. I keep thinking, man. But you know what? Listen, we're not going to agree on everything, Bob. But we do agree that we need to take back our constitutional republic, our liberties. We need to re-engage some of this. I think you and I have both talked about, again, we might have slightly different paths to that, but let's get back to that.
It's going to be interesting to see what happens. The legislature filed their lawsuit yesterday regarding Whitmer's move to basically ignore the legislature extending its latest order. So we'll see how that goes as far as one thing's for certain, the judiciary's been really silent and they need to start weighing in on more stuff. There was one case that was decided involving this, the judgment came out earlier this week involving someone that was suing based on the fact that they couldn't go to their home as part of that locked order. Their second home. Judge, this Christopher Murray, ruled in favor of the executive order using the balancing test, saying that, the crisis warranted the limited intrusion of them being able to go to their home. But the judge also said that that was being decided in a very narrow manner, just on that one question, and that there was a need for the courts to weigh in on the other very live issues that are out there. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. I did read yesterday, I believe, I can't remember, I think it was in either the Free Press or the Detroit News, I can't remember where, but they said that the judge that drew the case happened to be a Granholm appointee. So I don't know if they're going to,
I thought his ruling was bullshit. I really thought it lacked a great deal of legal precedent. I'll give you an example.
Well, no, I agree.
If it was because of the science that I couldn't go to my property up north, and people were actually fined in this state because of the science, if it was because of the science, then part of that executive order would have not allowed any snowbird from Florida or the southern states to be able to travel back to Michigan until they felt it was safe. Because here's the deal. You had the two largest events in the United States, the Super Bowl in Miami and Daytona 500, both in February, which we now understand, forget about the first confirmed case in Washington, the January 21st. It's probable, based on half a brain, that this was happening in Wuhan in early December. Travel was allowed to New York City, to Miami, to California, all of December, and it was already here. The majority of the people in Florida probably had the worst flu season they've ever experienced. The people that have talked to me that are older than me, in their 70s, and this was the worst year ever. They feel like they had already been exposed to it unknowingly.
A lot of people.
And so if it was really about the science, then they would have not allowed people to come back to their homes because it was about the science. It wasn't. It was about control. How much control can we actually take right now, and they'll let us have? And that's where I think people get so close to that explosion point, that where they're like, I will show up with my Second Amendment right, bearing my arm in public and shout at you because I don't have any other way to do it. Most people, like me, who reached out to their state senator, their state rep, did not even get a phone call back. And Senator, I believe it's Senator from Frankenmuth, the gentleman you showed me.
Ted Horn.
Yes. He's doing a fantastic job, at least communicating to his constituents through Facebook and other things. I appreciate that. I know Kevin Daly, who is not my, doesn't represent me, but he represents people just to the east of me. He reached out to me. We missed each other a few times, but at least he was making an effort. I appreciate the legislators that are willing to at least try to engage the community.
Right.
And I think, I know that the city centers have the most people. I really think we're in a position to be able to have the potential for a recall vote on the governor. And I think we need to express to her we don't believe in her. We don't trust her.
Right. Well, that's going to be interesting. I mean, they got enough signatures, and the board of canvassers, they're just waiting on them to approve it. Last week there was a technicality about the way that it was submitted, and so the petitioner from Albion withdrew it, and they were going to have it submitted this week. I can't remember how long the board of canvassers have. I think it's 7 like that too.
So you do know for sure that this is it's going through the process.
It's going through the process. Yeah.
Okay.
We submitted on Monday. I was kind of amazed because, in order to get it, you had to have like a little over 500,000 signatures. It's based on having 20% of what the votes that were cast for the governor in the election, which I believe were a little over 2 million, like 2,100,000. So they got the signatures in like 4 or 5 days, which just amazed me, to be honest. And like I say, when it was originally presented, it was addressed to this one. I think it was a different department, but it was one that the board of canvassers used, but it wasn't the exact one. So there was a technicality that Whitmer was going to oppose it on. So he withdrew it. They refashioned it, resubmitted it on Monday. So I think the canvassers have 7 to 15 days, I can't remember exactly, to approve it. So, I mean, yeah, I think it's going to go forward, And as far as the courts, I mean, it's hard to say, I mean, very likely this, appellate decision will be appealed to the Supreme Court. And I think regardless of what happens on the legislature, if the legislature prevails, I believe Whitmer's going to appeal it to the Supreme Court. If Whitmer prevails, I believe the legislature will appeal it to the Supreme Court. So I think all this stuff's going to go to the Supreme Court. But that's all going to take time, which I don't know how much we have. But.
Well, and I do hope the Attorney General, has been on record as saying he is very concerned about governors being unreasonable, authoritarian, tyrannical, and overreaching in their executive orders. And he's going to look into that from the Justice.